500 miles inside Russian territory. No air defense caught them. No radar tracked them. And by the time Moscow realized what was happening, the sky was already on fire. Let's start with something that most Western media completely missed. Novocherkassk is not a random city. This is not a mistake. This is not a stray drone that wandered off course. Novocherkassk sits in the Rostov Oblast, deep in the Russian heartland. Roughly 500 miles from the Ukrainian front line. It is home to the Novocherkassk State District power plant, one of the largest coal-fired power stations still operational in southern Russia. Built during the Soviet era, this facility generates over 2,400 megawatts of electricity at peak capacity. To put that in perspective, that's enough power to light up a mid-sized European country. But here's why Ukraine cares about it. This plant doesn't just power Russian homes. It feeds electricity directly into the grid infrastructure that supplies Russian military logistics hubs across the southern military district. Rostov, Russia's primary command center for southern operations, sits less than 40 kilometers from Novocherkassk. The rail depots, the ammunition transfer points, military hospitals receiving casualties from the Zaporizhia and Kherson fronts, all of them connected to this grid. Ukraine had been watching this facility for months, and on this particular night, they decided the lights needed to go out. To understand why this strike happened, you need to understand the pressure Ukraine was under. By early 2026, the war had entered what military analysts were calling the attritional grind phase. The front lines had barely moved. Russian forces had established deeply entrenched defensive positions across a 1,000-kilometer front. Ukrainian infantry, exhausted after nearly 4 years of combat, were fighting for every tree line, every trench, every ruined apartment block. But Ukraine had been quietly developing something that conventional armies don't have a good answer for: long-range FPV drone swarms. Over the past 18 months, Ukrainian engineers, many of them civilians working out of converted factories in Kyiv, Lviv, and Kharkiv, had been iterating on drone technology at a speed that genuinely shocked Western defense analysts. What started as modified commercial quadcopters became sophisticated, one-way attack drones with hardened communications resistant to Russian electronic warfare jamming. Ukraine went from building hundreds of drones per month to tens of thousands per month. The GUR, Ukraine's military intelligence directorate, had been running long-range drone strikes deep into Russia since 2023, Moscow Pskov, Ingles Air Base, the Kremlin itself. Each strike was more ambitious than the last. The Novocherkassk represented a quantum leap. This wasn't a symbolic strike on the Kremlin's lawn. This was a deliberate, precisely planned infrastructure attack against a target that would genuinely degrade Russian military capability, executed at a range that Russia had considered completely safe. The planners inside GUR had spent months on this. Satellite imagery likely provided by commercial operators, and according to some reports, supplemented by intelligence sharing from NATO partners, had been analyzed down to individual transformer stations, cooling towers, and switching infrastructure. They knew exactly where to hit. 3 days before the strike, Ukrainian drone operators were briefed in a secure facility that we will not name. The operation was compartmentalized to a degree unusual even by Ukrainian GUR standards. Only a small cell of officers knew the full scope. The drones selected for this mission were a variant of the Lyuty Ukraine-S domestically produced. The Lyuty is a fixed-wing, one-way attack drone loosely comparable in concept to the Iranian Sheit, except Ukraine built it to counter Russian jamming systems. Specifically, it flies low, uses pre-programmed GPS waypoints combined with optical terrain matching navigation, and can carry a warhead of approximately 50 kilograms of high explosive. For a target as large and hardened as a power plant, individual drones are not enough. That's why this was a swarm operation. Estimates suggest between 35 and 60 drones were prepared for this mission, each one preloaded with flight path data that routed them through radar shadow corridors, valleys, riverbeds, low terrain that Ukrainian intelligence had identified as blind spots in Russia's southern air defense network. The drones were not launched from a single point. This is crucial. Ukrainian operators have learned that launching from one location creates a trackable flight origin signature. Instead, The drones were transported in vehicles and launched from multiple dispersed positions. Across a wide geographic area, some reportedly from positions inside Ukrainian-controlled territory, others potentially from assets much closer to the Russian border. This is what made Russian radar tracking nearly impossible. It is approximately 2:30 in the morning, local time. One by one, in intervals calculated to confuse radar returns and overwhelm point defenses, the drones lift off into the cold night sky. Their navigation systems lock onto preloaded waypoints. Their engines small, quiet, fuel-efficient, settle into cruising altitude. Most fly at between 50 and 150 meters above ground level, below most radar thresholds. Below the engagement envelope of most Russian surface-to-air missile systems designed to deal with high-altitude threats. They cross into Russian airspace not as a wall, but as a trickle. Small radar returns, intermittent, scattered across a wide front. Russian air defense operators, if they see anything at all, see what looks like noise. Sensor clutter. Birds, maybe. Atmospheric interference. The drones keep flying. Somewhere inside Russian Air Defense Command, an operator flags an anomaly. A cluster of small radar returns southwest of Rostov Oblast, moving northeast at approximately 120 kilometers per hour. Not fast enough to be a missile. Too fast and too numerous to be conventional aircraft. The signature is confusing. An alert goes up the chain of command. But here's where Russian military bureaucracy becomes a weapon Ukraine exploits. In the Russian command structure, an alert requires verification before a response can be authorized. The verification takes time. And time on this particular night is the one resource Russia does not have. By the time the alert reaches a level where someone with authority to scramble intercept assets can act, the drones have already covered another 80 kilometers. Russian S-400 batteries in the region are active. Panzer S-1 short-range systems begin scanning. But the drones are flying their terrain masking routes. Using the Minute River Valley and surrounding lowlands as geographic cover, the radar picture remains fragmented and uncertain. The drones keep flying. The leading elements of the swarm are now within 60 kilometers of Novocherkassk. This is the most dangerous phase of the operation. As the drones close on the target, they begin converging their scattered approach, routes funneling toward the common objective. This convergence necessarily creates a more detectable radar signature. Russian air defense finally gets a cleaner picture. Panzer systems at a nearby military installation begin engaging. 3 drones, possibly 4, are destroyed in the engagement. Interceptor missiles streak through the night sky. For a brief moment, Russian air defense operators believe they have neutralized the threat. They are catastrophically wrong, because Ukrainian mission planners had accounted for attrition. This is standard doctrine for swarm operations. You expect to lose a percentage of your assets to air defense. You build that loss into the mission math. If you launch 50 drones and need 20 to reach the target, you plan for 60% attrition and accept it. The Panzer systems engage. They kill drones. They run through their ready-to-fire missile reserves. Behind the drones, they just killed. More drones keep coming. The first drone strikes the Novocherkassk power plant's eastern transformer yard. The transformer yard is the critical node. It's where the electricity generated by the plant turbines is stepped up in voltage for transmission across the regional grid. Transformers of this scale are extraordinarily expensive, take months to manufacture, and are essentially irreplaceable on short notice. Ukraine knows this. The targeting is deliberate and precise. Explosion is massive. High explosive warheads detonate against transformer housings filled with insulating oil. The oil ignites. Secondary fires cascade across the yard. Within seconds, an entire section of the eastern transformer array is burning. The first explosion is barely finished echoing when the second drone hits. Then the third. The drones are arriving in rapid succession now. Their staggered launch intervals calculated so they reach the target in a compressed time frame, overwhelming the point defenses and the ability of ground crews to respond. A cooling tower takes a hit. Auxiliary power infrastructure on the plant's northern perimeter is struck. Another drone, possibly navigating on optical guidance in its terminal phase, threads directly into the main turbine hall roof. The plant's automatic safety systems trigger a full shutdown. The turbines, sensing catastrophic structural damage, begin emergency ramp down. But it doesn't matter. The transformer yard is already destroyed. Even if the turbines were intact, there's nowhere to send the power. At 3:17 a.m. local time, the Novocherkassk State District power plant goes dark. And so does a significant portion of the Rostov Oblast grid. The lights go out across a wide area of Rostov Oblast. Rostov-on-Don, the city that serves as Russia's primary southern military district headquarters, loses power in multiple districts. Backup generators at military facilities kick in, but civilian infrastructure is not so lucky. Traffic systems fail. Hospital backup power engages. Some hospitals have it, some don't. Rail switching infrastructure at Rostov's massive rail junction, one of the busiest military logistics hubs in southern Russia, loses primary power. Trains that were moving ammunition and supplies toward the front are brought to a halt as rail switch. Operators lose the ability to coordinate track switching safely. Military communications infrastructure, while nominally hardened, experiences disruptions as civilian power substations that serve as redundant feed points go offline. It is, by any military definition, a successful infrastructure strike. In Moscow, the phones are ringing. The Southern Military District Commander is trying to reach the Defense Ministry. The Defense Ministry is trying to understand the scope of what just happened. Russian state media, TASS, Rossiya 1, are completely silent. The Russian government's instinct, honed over nearly 4 years of embarrassing attacks on Russian territory, is to suppress the story entirely. It will not work. By sunrise, satellite imagery is already being analyzed. Commercial satellite operators capture thermal imaging of the Novocherkassk plant site. The images show massive fire damage to the transformer yard. Structural damage consistent with multiple precision impacts. Smoke still rising from the cooling infrastructure. Images leak onto Telegram channels within hours. The open source intelligence community, the same community that has been tracking every aspect of this war, immediately begins analyzing and disseminating the imagery. Russian officials initially say nothing, and facing the impossibility of denying what satellite imagery clearly shows, Russian state media releases a carefully worded statement, acknowledging a Ukrainian terrorist attack on civilian infrastructure. While claiming that Russian air defenses destroyed the majority of enemy drones, military analysts immediately note the contradiction. If the majority of drones were destroyed, how did the plant burn? Ukraine's GU releases a brief statement of its own. No emotional language, just facts. The plant was struck. The operation was conducted by Ukrainian long-range drone assets. The facility provided power to Russian military logistics infrastructure. The statement ends with a sentence that sends a message to everyone paying attention. The distance from the front line is no longer a guarantee of safety. By day 3, the Russian response is visible and frantic. Additional S-400 batteries are repositioned toward the Rostov region. Panzer systems are deployed to protect other power infrastructure across southern Russia. Russian military engineers begin emergency assessments of power plant vulnerabilities at facilities across the entire southern and central grid. But here's what Russian military planners are realizing, and it is genuinely terrifying from their perspective. Ukraine has demonstrated the ability to penetrate 500 miles into Russian territory with a coordinated swarm of drones that defeated or saturated existing air defenses. The Novocherkassk plant was not the only facility on Ukraine's target list. GOR planners have built target packages for power infrastructure across a wide arc of Russian territory: substations, transmission lines, generating stations. The entire ecosystem of electrical infrastructure that feeds Russia's military-industrial complex. Russia cannot put S-400 batteries around every transformer in the country. The mathematics are simply impossible. An S-400 battery costs hundreds of millions of dollars. Each interceptor missile costs approximately $1 to $3 million. A Ukrainian long-range attack drone costs somewhere between $5,000 and $30,000, depending on the variant and payload. This is the asymmetric economics of modern drone warfare, and Russia is on the wrong side of the equation. 2 weeks after the strike, the consequences are becoming clear. The Novocherkassk plant is not coming back online quickly. The transformer damage alone will take months to repair, assuming Russia can source the replacement components, many of which, due to Western sanctions, Russia now struggles to procure. Some transformer components that Russia previously imported from European manufacturers simply cannot be replaced with domestic production on a meaningful timeline. Russian military logistics in the southern sector are being rerouted. Rail traffic that previously moved through Rostov's primary junction is being diverted to alternative routes longer, more fuel-intensive, less efficient. Ukrainian military intelligence begins noticing reduced resupply frequency at Russian forward positions in Zaporizhia Oblast. It is difficult to attribute causation definitively. The front is complex, and supply issues have multiple causes. But the pattern is there. Meanwhile, something more significant is happening in the psychological dimension of this war. Russian citizens in Rostov Oblast, many of whom had believed because their government told them that the war in Ukraine was a distant, controlled special military operation being conducted safely far from Russian territory, are now sitting in the dark. Literally, power rationing has been implemented. The war has arrived in their living rooms, their workplaces, their hospitals. Public discourse on Russian social media, despite heavy censorship, shows extraordinary levels of anger and anxiety. Russians who supported the war because it seemed to cost them nothing are now beginning to calculate the personal costs differently. This is the second-order effect that Ukraine's strategic planners had in mind. In Brussels, NATO analysts are studying the Novocherkassk strike with intense interest. Not because they are surprised, they have been watching Ukraine's long-range drone program develop for over a year. But because this strike confirms something that changes the fundamental strategic calculus of the war. Ukraine has developed a credible, scalable capability to hold Russian strategic infrastructure at risk across virtually its entire accessible territory without ballistic missiles, without Western-supplied long-range strike systems, and without crossing the escalation thresholds that Western partners have been so anxious to avoid. This is significant for a very specific reason. Western governments have spent years debating whether to provide Ukraine with a ATACMS, Storm Shadow, Taurus, or other long-range strike systems, agonizing over Russian escalation threats with every decision. Ukraine, in the meantime, built its own capability from scratch. A capability that is cheaper, more scalable, harder to intercept, and crucially provides Russia with less political justification for escalation because it did not come from Western arsenals. Behind closed doors in Washington and London, analysts are having a conversation about what this means for the future of warfare. Small states, long-range drone swarms, strategic infrastructure targeting. The Novocherkassk strike may end up in military doctrine textbooks for the next 50 years. Russia does not absorb this without a response. In the week following the Novocherkassk attack, Russian forces launched their own massive drone and missile barrage against Ukrainian energy infrastructure. It is brutal. Shate drones in waves of 100 or more. Kh-101 cruise missiles targeted at transformer stations in Kharkov and Dnipro. A coordinated effort to demonstrate that Russia can also inflict infrastructure damage, and they can. Ukraine's energy system takes significant hits. Power outages roll across eastern Ukraine. Repair crews who by this point have become extraordinarily practiced at emergency grid repair work through the night. But here's the strategic difference. Russia is spending its strategic missile reserves, weapons that cost millions of dollars each. Weapons that take months to produce. Weapons that Russia is manufacturing at an accelerating but still finite rate. Ukraine is responding with drones that cost thousands of dollars. The industrial exchange rate is devastating for Russia. For every Kh-101 cruise missile Russia fires at a Ukrainian substation, Ukraine can manufacture dozens of strike drones. The math over time runs in Ukraine's favor. Let's pull back and look at this from a purely military analytical perspective. The Novocherkassk strike succeeded for several interconnected reasons. And understanding them tells us something profound about how this war and future wars will be fought. First, target selection intelligence. Ukraine invested heavily in understanding not just where the plant was, but why it mattered. The connection between civilian power infrastructure and military logistics is not obvious unless you've done the analytical work. GER's intelligence picture was sophisticated. Second, swarm redundancy. By launching far more drones than necessary to achieve the mission objective, Ukraine guaranteed success even with significant attrition. This is expensive in hardware terms, but cheap compared to the value of the target. Russian air defense is not designed to handle this approach. Third, route deconfliction. The staggered, geographically dispersed approach routes prevented Russia from getting a coherent radar picture until it was too late to mount a coordinated defense. This required precise planning and probably multiple weeks of route analysis using terrain data and known radar positions. Fourth, timing. A 2:30 a.m. strike exploits natural human performance degradation in radar operators and response crews. This is not accidental. Ukraine times its major strikes with precision. Fifth, the 500-mile psychological threshold. Ukraine chose a target at this range deliberately, not just because of its military value, but because breaching 500 miles sends a message to Russian citizens, Russian military planners, and international observers simultaneously. It says, "We can reach you anywhere." Here is where we have to step back and ask the largest strategic question. What does this strike actually mean for the trajectory of the war? Russia faces a fundamental dilemma that the Novocherkassk strike has made dramatically more acute. It cannot defend all of its critical infrastructure from drone swarms. It cannot maintain its current offensive tempo on the front lines while simultaneously diverting massive resources to protect a grid that stretches across 11 time zones. It cannot match Ukraine's drone production economics. Ukraine, meanwhile, has found a formula that works. Long-range infrastructure strikes are not going to end this war on their own, but they degrade Russian military logistics. They impose economic costs. They affect Russian civilian morale in ways that 3 years of state propaganda have struggled to contain, and they make Russian military planners genuinely uncertain about the security of their rear areas. The Novocherkassk strike is not just a headline. It is a data point in a larger campaign. Ukraine's GUR is not done. The target list is long, and every strike of this kind adds another variable to Russia's already complicated strategic equation. For Russian military commanders trying to plan offensive operations in Zaporizhia and Donetsk, the question is no longer just how do we advance against Ukrainian defensive lines. The question has become, what else are we about to lose behind our own lines while we refocused on advancing? That is an extraordinarily difficult position to be in. For Ukraine, the question is sustainability. Can drone production scale fast enough? Can trained operators be protected and retained? Can Western intelligence and satellite support continue? These are not guaranteed answers. But for the first time in months, Ukraine has demonstrated a form of offensive initiative that Russia has no clean answer to. Before we close, let's talk about something that gets lost in the analysis of tactics and weapons systems. There are people in Novocherkassk sitting without heat. It's hospital patients whose treatments are being complicated by power disruptions. Workers who showed up to jobs that cannot function without electricity. And in Ukraine, there are people in Kharkiv and Dnipro sitting in exactly the same darkness. Because Russia has spent 4 years systematically attacking Ukrainian power infrastructure on a scale that dwarfs anything Ukraine has done inside Russia. Over 18 million Ukrainians have experienced extended power outages this winter. Ukrainian hospitals have run on generators. Ukrainian children have done schoolwork by candlelight. The deliberate Russian campaign against Ukrainian energy infrastructure, which international legal scholars have argued crosses the line into a war crime, has made the lights going out in Novocherkassk feel, to Ukrainians, like a fraction of justice. This is the brutal mathematics of modern warfare applied to civilian life, and it is why the phrase infrastructure war, clinical, analytical, bloodless sounding, contains within it a kind of suffering that statistics struggle to capture. So here's where we land. One night, somewhere between 35 and 60 drones, 500 miles. And a power plant that Russia thought was safely out of Ukraine's reach is now a burned-out ruin. The message Ukraine sent on that night was not just military, it was existential. It said to every Russian military planner, every Russian civilian, every Western government still debating how much support to provide, the geography of this war has changed. The rules have changed. The technology has changed. If you thought distance was protection, you were wrong. Russia will respond. Russia's already responding. The next round of infrastructure strikes from both sides is likely already in planning. The question is whether Russia's massive but costly missile arsenal can outlast Ukraine's cheaper, faster-producing drone ecosystem, and whether Ukraine's grid can survive another winter of Russian bombardment. The Novocherkassk strike is not the end of this story. It may not even be the most dramatic chapter. But it is a turning point. And turning points in war have consequences that echo for years. What do you think? Can Ukraine sustain this long-range drone campaign deep into 2026? Or will Russia adapt fast enough to close the gap in its air defenses? And if Ukraine keeps hitting targets 500 miles inside Russia, where does this escalation spiral end? Drop your take in the comments below. Hit that like button if this breakdown changed how you see this war, and subscribe, because this story is far from over. We'll see you in the next one.